Nothing to see here, folks. No greater social lesson to be learned. We're not, Bill O'Reilly didn't have a show on tonight where you'd be like, white man kills 14 people, shoots up 58, kick them all out the country. When mostly white men looted the banks of this country and wrecked Wall Street and wrecked the economy. And wiped out $12 trillion of other people's wealth. 20% of the accumulated wealth of this country, which it took 230 some odd years to build up. It took them 18 months to wipe it out. And they didn't say, that's it, y'all. White men, y'all are not going to be bankers anymore. We are done with you. Because we can commit any level of criminality. We can do anything that we want, and it will not stick to the rest of us. That is what white privilege is. It is the ability to never have to answer for all those other white folks, whether it is Klebold and Harris at Columbine, whether it is this man Holmes in Aurora, whether it is Eric Rudolph, the Olympic Park bomber, whether it is Tim McVeigh, whether it is any of those guys on Wall Street, because you know full well if some black folks had made off with $12 trillion worth of other people's money, you know what the conversation would have been. They would have, you know what the kind would have been like this. Well, how did these people even get these jobs? Oh, I think I know. They got them because of affirmative action. They weren't even qualified to be bankers. But white men make off with 12 trill, nobody pays any. And do you have any idea how long it would take for black and brown, like, street thugs to steal $12 trillion? Can y'all even calculate that? Like, honestly, you could take all the street thugs in the history of street thugs and all the black and brown street criminals in the history of black and brown folks or criminals, and it would still take them like 5,000 years to steal 12 trillion. And they would have to rob you around the clock, Jack, like 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year to make off with that kind of money. And at the end of 5,000 years, you'd be like, y'all got 12 trillion yet? And they'd be like, no, man, we're not even close. So deviance is racialized when it comes with a black or brown face, when it comes with a white face, whether it's corporate misconduct or whether it's stuff on the street or in a movie theater, it is de-racialized. That is how we got to this place. And we got to be clear, it's not just them, it's us. Because look, there's some survey data that's found, for instance, that 95% of white Americans, which means a lot of big liberals. I mean, I could just stand up here and rip on Rush and Sean Hannity, and that's fun and it's easy. But now, they're not the problem, because we know who they are. But 95% of white folks in surveys when asked, what do you see when you think of a drug user? 95% of us say a black person or another person. So that means a lot of those white folks that voted for Obama, you know what that means? That means a lot of us were saying, well, we don't like most of them, but that one's okay. So we're going to make him the Cliff Huxtable of American politics. But we still don't trust the rest of the community. We still think they're dysfunctional and deviant and pathological. And I'm not saying that's true for all, but I'm saying if you got 95% of white folks who, by their own admission, and they've been pre-tested, this survey I'm talking about, they pre-tested people for overt bias, and the people that said that, almost none of them had overt bias. Almost none of them were like overtly racist people, but when it came down to it, when it was like looking at subconscious, right, kinds of biases, right, or those kinds of things, that's what was exposed. Or they took another survey where they took white folks, a study where they took white folks, hooked us up to brain scan imagers, right, and it showed us computer images of black male faces flashed on the screen in such a brief period of time, just like a few hundred milliseconds, right, not even enough for the conscious brain to register what it saw. Only operating at the subliminal and subconscious level, and they flash these images on the screen, and they also flash other images like of a puppy dog, and a flower, and a caterpillar, and a candy bar, and cotton candy, and a swing set, or whatever. And what they found was when that black male image was flashed, once again, not long enough for you to even register that you saw it. Consciously, what happened? They had the imaging machines on what part of the brain lit up? The part that responds to fear and anxiety and stress. And it only happened when that image was flashed. When all these other images were flashed, nothing, nothing, nothing. All of a sudden, black male image lights up like a Christmas tree. 85% of whites in this stuff. What does this mean? What does it mean for our ability to build solidarity? Because that's the lesson we got to take away. Because you see, how are you going to build a class-based, economic justice-based solidarity when you got people in your solidarity movement, in your justice movement, who haven't dealt with our stuff? How do you do that? How do you build solidarity when we got people who are the quote-unquote good guys, and they are, and they mean well? We all want to do as good as we can by the cause of justice. That's why we're in these rooms. But if we haven't dealt with our stuff, and I mean by that white folks dealing with our stuff, I mean people of color dealing with the stuff that's been internalized because systems of oppression can't operate just as the dominant group wants them to. They have to colonize the minds of those who they target. We got to deal with that. How do we do it? Well, I'd love to tell you that all we had to do was stand up and give out facts and figures and numbers and prove, for instance. You know the data on stop and frisk. Less than 6% of all those persons stopped result in any kind of arrest. Less than 2% result in a confiscation of any drugs or weapons, which is the ostensible reason for which stop and frisk is done. We know that's nonsense. It's a mechanism of social control. Serves no crime control purpose. We understand that, but I got news for you. The bad news is, we understand that. The other bad news is, so do the folks who are operating stop and frisk, and they do it anyway. See, the idea that all you need is facts and truth on your side to move people politically, that's part of the progressive, that's part of our disease. I'm going to be honest with you. Part of our problem as progressives, liberals, leftists, radicals, whatever term you like to use for yourself, is that we have this unhealthy reliance on pure reason. We actually believe that people make decisions based on truth and facts and information. So if I have the best data, I remember years ago somebody said, well, why don't we just tell the politicians that it's cheaper to send kids to Harvard than to incarcerate them? Man, they know that. And they all send them to prison any damn way. Right? They know that. You think they didn't get that position paper from the Children's Defense Fund? They got the position paper. They know what's cheaper and what's more expensive, and they still make the wrong decision, which is to say facts are not the key here. What do we need in its place? Well, in addition to the commitment and the energy of those of you in the room, which I can tell you here, we have to also start telling our stories. Because you see, one of the things I learned back years ago when I was doing community organizing, traditional community organizing in the mid-90s around the regressive, and now we begin to see truly horrific welfare reform law, because we see what it's done now to poor families, particularly when the economy takes a downturn as it has done for the last several years. Those of us who were trying to make the case against that bill would use all kinds of facts. Man, I remember going into radio stations and cutting out all my note cards, and I was like, man, I was ready. You call me with anything. You want to talk about poor people? I'm down. I've got it. There's that note card, and there's that one. You're going to talk about this? I've got you. I'm going to win this debate. And at the end of those debates, every time, somebody would call in and say, yeah, well, liars always figure, and figures always lie. The idea was you can make numbers say anything. Not really. 2 + 2 is 4 like every day of the week. But if that is where you're coming from, where facts don't matter, I realize you've got to have a different narrative. What ended up working with some of those folks? Not enough, because we know that legislation still passed. I'm living with the consequences of it today. But what I found was that when we got folks to tell their stories, I'm talking about poor folks actually talking about their lives, not the mythologized lives that people wanted to craft for them. The lives and the narratives that said they were lazy and didn't want work, right? And didn't amount to anything and weren't good parents. When those folks got to tell their own stories, when the children got to tell their stories, when the parents got to tell their stories, you began to see a shift in some folks, because now you were putting human meat on these bones of data. And the same is true with these issues of the criminal justice system. About a month ago, many of y'all probably saw there was this video bouncing around. It's actually on the New York Times website, and I'm sorry that I don't remember the young man's name who was featured in it, but it was a video about this young man. It's like just about a 5-minute clip from, I think, a larger documentary that folks were putting together about stop and frisk. And this young man was talking about his life and how he just walks out of the house, like he's just going down to the store, or he's walking back from school, or he's doing whatever, and he's talking about how many times he's been stopped, never once having done anything criminal, never once having been given a citation, never once having been arrested for anything because he hasn't done anything. And finally, he talks about how he just doesn't go out anymore. And it was powerful, and I sent this thing around because I wanted to get, feedback, because I'll send around things like data. I mean, I've written a bunch of stuff on stop and frisk, and I include a bunch of data in my books, and people are like, yeah, that really helped me with my, dissertation or whatever. Well, glad to help with your data collection. But when it comes to actually moving people, right, it was that man's story that did it. And more to the point, this is a challenge for white folks in the room. It's not enough to get black and brown folks talking about their negative experiences with law enforcement, y'all are going to have to start, we are going to have to start talking about our positive experiences with law enforcement. How many times did we get away with something that we shouldn't? How many times were we stopped and given a warning? How many times when we were young, or maybe just last week, did some of us light up something that is illegal in this country and know that we weren't going to get busted for it? See, we got to be honest about all the times that we weren't racially profiled. I've written about this, and I've talked about my own experience, you know, I mean, because the statute of limitations has expired, so I can talk about all that. We better be honest, though, because there are people out there who still are believing that criminality and deviance, particularly drug-related criminality, is black and brown, even though we know the data says white folks are equally or more likely to use drugs than people of color. So now, if there's data that says that, my guess is y'all have some stories that say that. And we need to start sharing those stories. We need to be telling the story of all the times that we weren't profiled, that we weren't busted, that we weren't arrested, that we weren't prosecuted, that we didn't have to worry about driving down the road with something in our car that we shouldn't have had, and we knew we weren't going to get stopped. The last time that we blazed up and we didn't, even though we will make you paranoid, actually get paranoid enough to think that we were going to get stopped. We have to be honest. And unless we start to tell those stories, I assure you solidarity will become hard to come by. But if we're willing to tell the truth, if we're willing to say, not only have some people been down in this thing, but others have been up, and it's dividing us, and it's keeping us from working together, then and only then do we stand a chance. I thank you all so much for being here. Why?